We still have to work on getting the elevator welcome music, Chris, for the next webinar, instead of awkward silence.
We'll add that to the list.
Welcome everyone to the AGB workshop number 2 on our transformation series for board members and presidents. I'm Paul Friga. I'll be one of your co-hosts for today, and I'm delighted to see so many of you signing up on a hump day afternoon or morning, depending upon where you are, I guess. We have a great turnout for this topic, which is extremely timely and important, one of the top priorities for leadership in universities across the country. And that's understanding and adapting to the fiscal realities in higher ed today, with an emphasis look on public. But of course, we've increasingly had a group of privates ask if they can come to these sessions, so it can be applied to privates as well. We have special guests from Kent State University, who we'll be introducing in just a minute, and also from the Chronicle of Higher Education. Lee Gardner is a seasoned writer, a senior writer on topics especially related to fiscal management in higher education. We're going to go through some slides. We sent those in advance. I saw some people even signed up today, so we'll also make those available to you after the conference. You'll receive a link to the video as well as the slides as a normal part of AGB protocol. And Chris is going to cover some of the mechanics as another one of our co-hosts before we get into our content. Chris?
Thanks, Paul. Hi, folks. As I just mentioned in the chat, we're going to be recording the first 30 minutes or so of today's session, which will be the plenary discussion between Paul and our folks from Kent State University and Lee Gardner from the Chronicle. We'll turn the recording off after that, and we'll make sure that that recording does go out to you as a follow-up. Other than that, if you have questions or comments as we get into the later portions of the event today, feel free to pop those into the chat, and I'll be monitoring those, and we'll make sure to feed those back out to Lee and to Paul and our guests. Other than that, we're going to do some breakout rooms sort of in the middle, and those have been pre-assigned, and we'll be making sure that everybody has at least a couple of folks to coordinate and communicate with once we do those breakouts. And other than that, if anything comes up, feel free to reach out to me in the chat, and I'll be happy to try to help you out. Paul?
Thank you, Chris. All right, I'm assuming everybody can see the slides okay. Somebody give me a thumbs up that's transfer. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tom and Rodney. Hey, Rodney, good to see you again. And congratulations on your big gift your university just received. A timely gift for investment in your students. So transformation, by way of introduction, I'm the leader, the practice area leader of a new practice area in AGB consulting, that is the transformation of public higher education. And in previous lives, I was a consultant for PwC and then McKinsey & Company. At PwC, I did bankruptcy turnaround consulting, which certainly fits in the transformation category. I came to Carolina for an MBA, and then I went and worked for McKinsey, and I did some higher ed consulting, including for the Ohio State University. And then came back for a PhD in strategy, and I've been in higher ed for the past 20 years teaching strategy, teaching management consulting, doing consulting, and now have decided to try to help AGB grow its practice area to serve public higher ed because there's such a need for transformation. I also formed a small benchmarking company, ABC Insights, 6 years ago that grew to 72 universities, including many of your universities, for administrative labor and academic labor benchmarking FTEs, and that was purchased by Helio Campus last summer. So that's why I was looking for something else to do, and that's where I landed at AGB. So transformation, by definition, it means dramatic change in form or appearance, extreme or radical change. When I talk to presidents and board members, I'm saying, I want to talk to you about your 5-year out and 10-year out vision, and tell me the major things that need to change at least 20% to get there. And so transformation to me is more than a 20% change. Incremental change is something I'm not extremely interested in. I think higher ed is in a chance to reinvent itself. and we want to contribute to that. So here's our flow for today. I'm going to spend 5 minutes. Those of you who know me, that's almost impossible for me to do 5 minutes on any topic. But I do have some slides to take you through, and I also sent them out in advance. And we'll talk a bit about setting the stage for fiscal realities in today's higher ed. But then the stars of the show are Virginia and Todd, who are coming to us from Kent State University, the president and trustee, vice chair of Kent State, who have a wonderful story of transformation in tough times. And they were in great shape even before the pandemic took them into tougher times. And now they're able to make some strategic moves as a result of that. So it's a great story that illustrates our content. Then we'll go, as Chris mentioned, into our breakout groups, all pre-assigned, and you'll automatically be moved in. We're keeping them small on purpose, and we hope all of you do turn your screens on for that session, as well as when we come back for the fun report out and our guests are staying all the way through. So that's a really fun way to say what was discussed in your small groups and share best practices and pain points as well. So it's a hands-on experience, as you can see, and I'm going to take you through a few thoughts on what's going on in higher ed from a fiscal perspective. The challenge is, as AGB has done research on how concerned you are about the future of higher ed, you can see 42% are very concerned. If you see the blue line for 2019, that got even worse in 2020, of course, because we were already teetering on tough financial times for higher ed, and that just pushed us into an uncharted territory that everybody's been dealing with. And even when we return to normal, we're still going to be challenged and more challenged as a result of the decreases of resources as a result of COVID. You can see on the right-hand side, they did a ranking of the leaders for what the biggest issues are. Number one, financial sustainability of higher ed. Number two, the price. And there's a lot of pressure to keep tuition low or even frozen for a number of years and decreasing due to the 1.7 trillion in debt. And there's more news coming out about possible free proposals for community college education, which will be quite disruptive in our industry as well. Decreasing in state funding, public perception of the value. So all of these things feed to it's time for change. One of the other big one that I'm sure you've been aware of, I hope someone has pointed this out to you, there's going to be a real drop in traditional high school graduates over the next 7 years. And that is going to affect all of us. And so, you can plan as hard as you want for the competition for normal enrollments, but this puts more pressure on things like increasing your retention rate because there are going to be fewer traditional students to go after. Another big strategy folks are doing in terms of revenue growth is going after the non-traditional students, older students, as I covered in the session last week. A few of you who did not come last week, we're going to send out a link to all the material from last month. We do these sessions the last Wednesday of every month, except for May. It's the third Wednesday, not the fourth. And we hope this provides a 12-month curriculum related to transformation of public higher ed. So we did cover some of these macro trends then. I didn't talk last week, but I want to mention this. I had an article in the Chronicle where I did a research study partnered with EY Parthenon, and we studied hundreds of universities, put them in a big database, analyzed the impact of resources and expenses. And by our calculations, it was about a 14% loss of resources by institution. So raise your hand if your number was somewhere in that ballpark, between 10 and 14% decreases. I can't see, Lee, I can't see yours. Okay. So that was what we saw on average. When you added all that up, that's $85 billion across the industry. Unique expenses using the ratio APLU calculated of another 24. And then I used the 25% hit from last year, or from the Great Recession for state funding. I thought it would be at least equal to that for state and local support decreases of 74 billion. It hasn't been that bad, but don't think that it's over, because they're still calculating their losses in states. And when you get into next year, some of these are on biannual budget processes. You still might see some more decreasing revenues from states, even though there was a pretty nice stimulus package for them. So 74 billion, you add it up, that's about $180 billion in lost resources. And then has the federal government filled that gap? Well, to a certain extent, yes. And we were delighted to see this, but about half of all the money coming from the government for higher ed is going to students, which is terrific in grants and aid. So half of it's coming to institutions. So you got about 19 billion from the first two stimulus packages, and the last one was 40 or another 20. And I wrote an article in the Chronicle about that we should actually be getting closer to 150, and here's how to invest it if anyone's interested. But by my calculations, we still have to absorb over $100 billion with you all. So that means the institutions themselves have to make up for that shortfall because the resources just aren't there. It may not be this large, but it is quite significant, as we mentioned before. And we've all done scenario planning. I do programs on that, and we're all kind of figuring out what the new normal is going to be. So that will continue into the next few years. Just to start wrapping up this high level section, I want to mention that universities have been finally cutting. I've been presenting at conferences for about 6 years, and I see Greg is there, and I see some other people who have seen me presenting with a common theme of we're not cutting expenses enough, and then we're not reinvesting for growth the right way. In other words, we're not continuously transforming like most industries do. So now there have been significant cuts. This is surveys of presidents and CFOs as to whether they're going to cut administrative costs, which is typically where they go to first. And that's not going to cover these deficits. They have to go to academic. And next month, we're talking about how to increase ROI from the academic side. So about my opinion, you need to hit both in terms of cost control, but you don't just cut, you also grow. Here are some of the main strategies that universities have taken to get through the pandemic: hiring freezes, furloughing staff, leadership pay cuts, salary cuts, laying off staff, and then delaying capital projects, amongst others. Okay, so I went over as usual, I apologize, but now I'm gonna take some of that in terms of context, and we're gonna have a conversation with our special guests from Kent State University. And then Lee and I will pepper them with some questions and follow-up questions to learn about how they've been so successful at transforming. Welcome. A softball to get things started. You know, strategy is about big picture leadership. That's the role of the board. That's the role of the president. Virginia, perhaps you could start with, you know, what's the philosophy of Kent State University when it thinks about fiscal management and fiscal investment?
Well, I think that the first thing that absolutely jumps to mind is over the years of my tenureship as a trustee, we absolutely have a student first organization. And so anything that has to do with fiscal, certainly, I mean, we're all in the same boat. At the end of the day, we've got to be able to pay for everything and hopefully have some money left over. But everything we do, whether it's changing majors, adding programs, deleting programs, et cetera, is always looked at through the lens of the student. Why is the student coming here? When they leave, what kind of a degree are we giving them? Are they marketable? Can we help them out in the community? And then, of course, always as well, working very closely with the community, whether it's schools, whether it's businesses, not-for-profits, et cetera, to make sure that we're doing things at Kent State that really match up with what is needed out there in the, and I hate to use the word, but real world. You know, we launch these people into something. Can they get employed? And so I'd say student first is incredibly important. And when I say that, I will also say we are incredibly and intentionally focused on our faculty with great relationships with the faculty. And I will say I attribute a lot of that to Todd, because as you know, Todd was also the provost of the university before. And doing anything on the fiscal side and changing programs, et cetera, is very difficult if you don't have a great relationship with the faculty or they're not well loved, liked, and feeling very valued. So that would be my answer.
In fact, Todd, you are a history professor turned provost. No one, well, I don't say no one, but it may be surprising to some that you're on a panel. You're featured as a case example of how to be fiscally responsible for a university. Can you describe your approach to, as Virginia mentioned, outcomes and metrics and using that, but combining it with academic excellence?
Yeah, for sure, Paul. And certainly I agree with what Virginia said. Look, it's pretty simple. Philosophy is pretty simple. First of all, we right size our expenditures to revenues. Secondly, we do that regularly. We don't let that build up for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So first of all, we right size expenditures to revenue. Secondly, we try to do our cuts differentially. Certainly always through a lens of students first. And by the way, Paul, it's super easy to say that. I can give you examples of how we've done that, but the proof is really in the pudding, right? I haven't said anything yet that anybody's going to disagree with. Really, the proof is in the examples and the reality. I would also second what Virginia said, which is we think a lot about our employees. I mean, we know that our employees have mortgages. We know that our employees have children. We know that our employees have hopes and dreams, and so we really try to take care of our employees. And as we have reduced noticeably those numbers of employees, one thing that we will now take care to do is to focus on how, with a reduced number of employees, we can continue to be one of the nation's top employers. You know, Forbes just recognized Kent State as the 4th best employer in the state of Ohio. They put us ahead of the Cleveland Clinic. They put us ahead of Sherwin-Williams. And it's really because we have that mentality. So that's my philosophy.
Yeah, the idea of outcomes, you kind of glazed over this a bit, that you were saying many universities would have the same philosophy, but you're so careful to avoid across the board cuts. And I got to be honest with you, I've seen a number of universities use that. Every time I do a strategy workshop, I say, you can't do that. Well, you can do it, but you shouldn't do that because it's not really investing in the right areas. It's assuming that everyone is at the right levels. And we know that some should be decreased and others increased based on current priorities. Can you describe very specifically how you're able to use data and work with your organization to make the differential cuts, to use your language?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. First of all, particularly in the pandemic, if you're thinking about students first, then we asked our non-academic affairs vice presidents to reduce their budgets by twice as much as academic affairs. That's the first thing. Secondly, and there are strengths and weaknesses in this, we have a responsibility-centered management budget. And so we did also have differential cuts college by college based on their budgets. But in general, we focused on making cuts in areas that would impact the students the least. So we did not cut academic affairs or enrollment management to anywhere near the level of all their vice presidencies. And the president's office took a 32% cut during the pandemic.
Todd, I'm curious if I can jump ahead a little bit here. You know, one of the things I hear constantly from smart presidents and from consultants is that you can't cut your way to sustainability. You have to be able to grow too. And, you know, I'm curious about what you've done to improve things on the revenue side. Because, you know, things are challenging these days, and frankly, things are especially challenging in a state like Ohio.
Yeah, good question, Lee. If I were going to add a coda to my philosophy of budgeting, it would be to look for targets of opportunity and investment. So let me just give you 2 examples. We cut 10% of our budget for this fiscal year, $65 million. And yet we increased by $1.5 million base funding for mental health for our students. If you have a students first mentality, that's just one thing you have to do. And, you know, it's both the right thing to do, but also, you know, we're laser focused on completion. And we know that that's very important in today's world. So that's one example. The second example is, when I arrived at Kent State, we did not have an engineering program. We had a College of Technology, but not a College of Engineering. But we knew we didn't have the resources to build a College of Engineering of all things. we have one of the nation's top ranked flight training programs. So we're very good in things aeronautics, aerospace. So we now have an aerospace engineering program. That's paid off huge dividends for us. That college is up 56% in enrollment since 2017. Just had a meeting with our vice president for enrollment management today, and we're exceeding our expectations for a freshman class. Most of that is driven by our recently launched engineering program.
I'll tell you, as a strategy professor, again, the point of prioritization based on some differentiation is so important for all the leaders on this call. You can say it theoretically, but there's so much isomorphism in our industry, a lot because of the rankings that rank everyone with the same types of metrics and when they shouldn't, because of the unique missions and positions of our institutions. But private industry, and Michael Crow was on it last month, he said, we need so many more different models of doing things. Pick your area and grow that. You also have a great reputation for access and success. You're really focused on providing lower tuitions and easy admissions. And then you put more energy into making sure the students have success. And you've dramatically grown your graduation rates. And as a result of that, got more resources from the state, which does a performance-based model. Virginia, how does the board get engaged in fiscal conversations?
Well, definitely, obviously we've got a lot of good, if you look at our board makeup, we're very intentional about the way we also pick board members or work with the state and the governor to pick our board members. We want to make sure that we've got certainly people from business, from not-for-profits, et cetera. I mean, we've got a whole different, we've got legal people, finance people, et cetera. So we've got a really nice group of people around the table. The other thing is we have an excellent relationship with the executive team of Kent State. And so when we sit down to talk, we really have a candid talk and we talk about it all and certainly ask difficult questions, but encourage and motivate forward as well as we hear things that are really good. From the standpoint, we're always looking at everywhere we're spending money. Of course, we spend a lot of time on the budget and expenditures. And I saw on one of your slides, right, where you were talking about, during the fiscal, in the last year or so, people have cut things like capital spend. We spend a lot of time as a board figuring out a 10-year capital improvements plan for Kent State. And at the beginning of last year, right away, but we didn't have to wait. Todd had already, and his team had already said, hey, listen, we need to go back and look at this. And so we've been flexible. We said, okay, hold on. Yes, we wanted to do all this in quote normal times. We would have done all this. Let's go back and take a look and let's see what's really going to pay off. Let's see what we think the enrollment's going to be, et cetera. The other thing is I really believe, and this does go back a bit to certainly the faculty, the staff, and the students, but we're also very invested as the entire community, and I would say that we've done a good job of getting alumni involved in this too, is really looking at, you can get people to come through your door. How do you get them to stay? And so Todd and team have really invested a lot in programs around maybe diverse individuals who are coming, who may be first time at university. And again, Todd said we didn't cut in these areas because once you get somebody through the door, somebody who's had a whole history of having everybody in the family go to college has plenty of support at home. I look at it and think, we've got great support network for our students who are coming, whether they're fiscally or just in general don't understand the whole college program. We've got a lovely support system that helps those people stay engaged, and get them to really being able to excel, get that degree, and many of them even go on to get graduate degrees, which makes us all very happy as well. But I guess the thing is, I think we're all aligned on where we're trying to go. And we're very flexible, understanding if this happens, then maybe we have to go this way. If that happens, we go another way. So I really do think it's that relationship with the board, it's the makeup of the board, and we're all on the same page with the strategy.
And your board is well known for being engaged with AGB.
Yes.
Your board professional has written professional guidance for other board professionals. So educating the board. You get the right board on board, and then you educate them and you talk about the right topics, and
Yes.
you do it in a strategic way. It's commendable.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, it's important to have, some integration and partnership with the board. These days, and I find this certainly in a lot of the reporting I'm doing, one of the most important relationships you're going to have to make some progress is with faculty, especially if you're going to be doing cuts or rearranging academic programs. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit, Todd, about how you've worked with the faculty to bring them along and consult with them throughout this process of kind of change and cuts and adding things.
Yeah, that's been really important. We have a unionized faculty. So we have two different unions. We have a union for our full-time non-tenure track faculty and a union for our tenure track full-time faculty. Inherently there's a certain amount of contestation built into a unionized campus, but actually I embrace it because as long as you can get to the point where you agree on the procedures and the rules, it's much easier to deal with a situation that way than in previous institutions I've served that didn't have a union. And you felt like anytime something popped up, you were making it up each time as you went along. Secondly, and I should have added this to my philosophy of budgeting, is you just have to commit to transparency. And that's why I asked Paul to include in the suggested readings the narrative budget memo that I send out every fall. I mean, once you read that, you have the same understanding of Kent State's budget that I do. And we specifically write it in a narrative form so that it'll be accessible not just to specialists, but to people like myself. So I think transparency. And then when you make those hard decisions in consultation with your faculty leadership, there's a base of trust before you have to make those decisions.
I will tell you, as a faculty member, and I've done a lot of strategic projects at UNC, strategic projects on UNC and other campuses, your advice is terrific, but one of the things that they get most nervous about is disruption of their status quo. And when I've talked to other presidents, I try to isolate. I'm doing research as to why we don't transform more. And in many cases, it goes back to the current incentive programs are very positive for faculty as they are. Do you do something different with incentives? Because it is great to say we include them, and we're transparent with them, and we but to make someone teach more online or to cancel a class and move into a new area, or how do incentives work? And Virginia, you can answer that too.
Well, if I'll let Todd answer that question, but I want to put another point out there as well. Todd has hit upon this, but I want to make it very crystal clear. We all know the relationships are not built in a day. They're not built on this last thing that happened. And so I think it's incredibly important to have people having a culture of, an overused maybe word in this sense, but of inclusion, communication, letting people know what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing, all those things. Because if you've got a history built on trust, but this is what we said was going to happen 3 years ago, and this is what we did. This is why we made this left turn 4 years ago. That's why we did it. And now I see that really was a great idea. For instance, we put this engineering program in a number of years ago. As Todd said, I think it was 50-some% growth since 2017. People see that, oh, you know what, adding that was a great idea. When people start to get that trust that, yes, you tell me, you include me, you don't hide things from me, and Todd tells the good and the bad, when things are going great and when things are not going well. I think that's when you really get to the point where people understand when you can. I've always been a firm believer in my roles as leader in business of when you tell people the good and the bad, and you tell them the why behind, why would we want to make this change? What's going to happen with them? Or how is this going to make things different? First, people's reaction is always, well, what about me? Everybody, I don't care who you are. It's always like, well, gosh, how does that impact me? But I think when you've built this nice foundation of trust, people can start to listen and ask the right questions and understand the direction you're taking. The other thing I think is very important is for Todd to explain. I could do it, but I'm going to let Todd do it, is to explain when we keep talking about, and then we made faculty cuts. We didn't go out and say, okay, kind of last in, first out, bang, bang, bang. Okay, you're all gone. I think it's very important that Todd explains exactly what we did, because it's very different, and everybody felt very at peace with how these faculty reductions, I hate to use the word cuts, these reductions and really realignments took place.
So yeah, I'll explain that and then a couple of other things. We, in the past 2 years, we've reduced our full-time faculty numbers by 105. It's about 10% of our full-time faculty. And we did it 100% through a voluntary separation plan. I would far rather do it that way than eliminate positions where people don't want to leave. So I'm very proud of that. And the reason we were able to do that, Paul, is because we've been making cuts since FY 2017. So in 2017, we reduced our budget by 2.7%. In 2019, we reduced it by 3.6%. And to put that in context, when I was an academic leader at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, at the Great Recession, we had to cut our budget by 3%. We thought the sky was falling. So we were able to reduce the number of faculty through a voluntary separation plan because we had been making cuts all along. That's the first thing. A couple of other things. Look, you have to have two things to have an institution of higher education. Now, there's a multiplicity of models for higher ed. You can have a community college, you can have a small private liberal arts college, you can have a big state university, you can have all variations of everything in between. But you have to have two things to have an institution of higher education. If you don't have these two things, you don't have an institution of higher education, faculty and students. So I really focus on building a positive relationship with faculty. I never see them as opposition. I am a tenured faculty member myself because I don't have a university without faculty. So I feel pretty, as you can tell, pretty strongly about that. Secondly, transformation. Paul, you know, you're dealing with a historian. So first of all, I can just give you a history of failed prognostications about transformations. Oh, we got to do this big transformation or we'll not survive. Transformation for transformation's sake, that's not going to do us a whole lot of good. And then, you know, as a corollary of that, I'm a big fan, I think because I'm a historian of Latin America and he is a historian of Latin America, I'm a big fan of John Lombardi's book, How Universities Work. And in that book, Lombardi says, look, if you're not at a really wealthy institution or big flagship university, let those people spend $1 gazillion figuring out what the best way forward is, and then adopt best practices. So we certainly, I think we focus on that as well. And then finally, we just focus on making sure that our students have good critical thinking skills. Now, I don't know, I'm reading this book right now, Future Proof, and by the New York Times columnist who wrote a pretty provocative article about how he thinks robots will eventually replace accountants. And we have a big accounting program at Kent State, right? But we got to think about how are we going to graduate every single student with skills that will survive artificial intelligence and automation.
And those macro trends, I'm going to give Lee one more chance for a question, but, you know, from pragmatic advice though, you did the voluntary separation, but I know that how heavily you use data for things like program reviews to check enrollments and faculty productivity and the right areas, as well as every position administratively that gets proposed has to be screened through a benchmarking process before just letting people grow FTEs. So there is another piece of just discipline and based on data that is
Yeah, and to that, Paul, let me just say that since those cuts began in FY 2017, we have something called the Strategic Position Control Hiring Committee, whatever it's called. I was on it. It's the provost, it's the senior vice president and CFO, it's the VP for HR. And we just added, and I think this speaks to who we are as an institution, the VP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So every single hire has to go through that committee. And for about 5 years as provost, I said no to a whole lot of people. So once you've established your reductions, you really have to engage in that kind of behavior to make sure that you're not quickly increasing those expenditures again. Absolutely.
You know, one of the things, if I could just jump in and also, because I just think it bears repeating, and I'm sorry to say repeat, but I think one of the things that we've done very well under Todd's leadership and with his executive team is had a strategy, right? So we work on a strategy. We've got a strategy to go forward. We've got a strategy also fiscally to save and to spend our money correctly. And Lee said this in a different way, but I know when we were having a pre-meeting, I said this. One of the very first things I was ever told when I took over as president and CEO of the company I worked with was, Virginia, always remember, you cannot save your way to salvation. Yes, you can keep making cuts. Yes, you can try and make the bottom line look better. But unless you're figuring out, in our case at Kent State, how do you bring more students through the door? How do you keep those people until they graduate and then even maybe into graduate school? But how do you align your curriculum and your programming to meet the needs of tomorrow? If you don't do those things right alongside each other in parallel, you can end up with, you can just keep saving and you end up with nothing because you've got the same old behind you. You do those things in parallel. And again, you do it with the trust and the valuing of your faculty, staff, and students. You're going to have a recipe for success.
I'm going to give Lee the last question, and we'll be winding down and move to our discussion groups. And we're going to have you in smaller groups cover some of these same things with the general theme of what are your best practices and what do you have questions about to learn from each other. Lee?
Thanks. And just so that you all know, I have enjoyed being here, but I will not be here for your small group discussions, just in case you were nervous about having a reporter around. But for my little swan song here, I will ask a question that I ask in interviews all the time, and I'll ask it of both of you, which is, so you get a call from a peer, a friend who says, my institution is going through tough times. We really need to change up things. We saw what you've been doing. What's your one piece of advice, the one thing that they must do or must not do? Whichever one of you likes can go first.
I'll jump in because I think you probably have already guessed what I would say is I would want to have a discussion around what the culture of the organization that they're trying to do this in looks like, because you can't take somewhere where the culture is not good and all of a sudden start making lots of big changes and not have kind of an implosion. So I would really say to them, first and foremost, look at the culture of the organization. You may have to do a little work there before you do something else. But the bottom line is the culture is going to really drive the positive outcomes and the speed at which you can make moves and changes. And then I would, of course, tell them the same thing. Work on the fiscal side of getting it right, but also work on where's this organization got to go for the future and what are you going to change?
And for me, Lee, I would say, since I only have one thing, show your work, be transparent. Let people understand that they can trust that what you're telling them is what you understand the reality to be and that you're not holding things back.
That's a great way to end it. I just got my first set of goosebumps. Those of you who have heard my webinars before, that's when something really hit me. Todd, the way you were phrasing that made me think of everything I needed I need for life I learned in kindergarten. I'm thinking about my 7th grade boy who tries to do his math in his head, and I was like, show your work. So it goes to the transparency, but it also goes to these lessons of keep it simple, keep it straight, keep it honest. And this was encouraging. Thank you both for your time, for your insights. I know that you're going to join the small groups where some people will be lucky to have you in those, and then we will bring you back. You're going to join us for our wrap up. We're going to go 20 minutes now into small groups to continue this dialogue. The key question for you in your groups is what are you doing in a best practice related to fiscal management and both cut and grow and some of these other themes, or what are some of your pain points, and just kind of get to know each other. The groups, we're going to have 12 groups, about 5 to 6 in those. One person, okay, that we don't have a bunch of assigned facilitators. So one person volunteers to say, okay, I'll be the discussant, and don't have a lot of discussion about who that person is. Just someone who is comfortable doing it will be the lead discussant, and someone say, I'll be the reporter. And so I'll capture some of the key takeaways when we do our report. Anybody can do those other things, but just so you're not sitting around trying to figure out what your process is. That's what we've done before, and it's worked well. Also, of course, introduce yourself and your university. So good luck. We're going to give you 20 minutes, actually 22 minutes, and we're going to bring you back at 3:05. Now I'm crossing my fingers, hoping that the technology gods work